Imagine a night in New York in 1890. Up there, the brilliant lights of Fifth Avenue. The clinking of crystal glasses, melodious music, ball gowns flaring wide amidst perfect waltzes. And down below, just a few streets away, was another world. Dark, damp, crowded, where human breath and smoke merged into the smell of poverty. There, children slept on rotten wooden floors. Adults hunched their backs, working 16 hours a day, and the whole city pretended not to see. But one man saw. And he didn't just look, he recorded it. With an old camera, a trembling lens, and a heart that refused to be silent. His name was Jacob Riis.
In those days, America was intoxicated by the Gilded Age, an era of industrial explosion where steel, electricity, and oil created new kings: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt. The entire country seemed to be gilded, gleaming on the outside, but rotten on the inside. Half the country lived on the heights, while the other half languished in the cellar. Jacob Riis once belonged to that lower half. He came to New York from Denmark, a poor young man carrying a few coins and the hope of finding the American dream. But that dream, the moment he touched it, crumbled to dust. No one would hire an immigrant. No place to sleep, no money for food. Jacob Riis wandered through foul-smelling alleys, doing any job he could find: carpenter, doorman, newsboy, even scavenging for scrap iron. He slept in parks and was once chased out of a church simply for being dressed in rags. And it was there, at the very bottom of hunger, that he saw a cruel truth. America was not just the promised land, it was also the land of the forgotten.
But Riis did not sink. He rose. With all the tenacity of a man who had known hunger, he got a job as a reporter for the New York Tribune. The pay wasn't high, but he found something more important: a weapon. The pen. He began to write about what he saw: the dark, windowless rooms, the children working in factories, the women exploited to the point of exhaustion. But Riis quickly realized no words could make the rich truly understand what it meant to be hungry. They were used to the word poverty on paper, but they had never seen it with their own eyes. And then, in 1888, flash powder was invented. A magnesium mixture that burned brightly for a few seconds, enough to take pictures in the dark. It sounds simple, but to Riis, it was a miracle. This light, for the first time, allowed him to shine a light on the places society always avoided. Imagine the scene: Jacob Riis, a camera in one hand, flash powder in the other, navigating the wretched tenements of Mulberry Street. He would open the door to a cramped room, set off the flash. Bang! A brilliant light flared, white smoke billowed, and the entire room was illuminated for 1 second. 1 second. Enough for him to see it all. The gaunt faces, the startled eyes, the children sleeping on the wooden floor, the hands clutching one another. And he pressed the shutter. It was just a small click, but it echoed like an explosion against the conscience of American society. Riis had done what no one had dared to do. He captured the truth. Those pictures were not beautiful. They were brutal. No artistic lighting, no delicate composition, only raw, naked reality. But because of that, they became unforgettable. People say a photograph can freeze time, but Riis's photos didn't freeze time. They punctured it. They forced America to stop and look at itself. A year later, he compiled his articles and photographs into the book How the Other Half Lives. The title sounds like a simple question, but it was, in fact, an indictment. The other half. How did the other half of America live? Now, no one could pretend not to know. Riis was not a writer. He wrote bluntly, directly. His words were not polished, but were like a hammer striking stone. He told of a 20-square-meter room housing 10 people. Of a 6-year-old girl who sewed shoes until her hands bled. Of a father who died in a workshop and was carried out like a sack being thrown away. Every line was a stab. Readers were horrified. For the first time, middle-class America saw on whose backs the American dream was built. And as for the upper class, they could not sit still. Jacob Riis didn't stop at writing. He began to give lectures, bringing with him a projector, his images, and a voice full of fire. He projected his photographs onto the wall, recounting each story. The light from that projector, shining on the faces of the ladies and gentlemen in the audience, made them lower their eyes. There was no more laughter, no more glasses of wine, only silence. And in that silence, many began to weep. One wealthy woman stood up and said, "I have lived my whole life in the light, but only now do I realize how close the darkness is to my home." That was Riis's power, not to force pity, but to make people see. Because when people see, they cannot turn away. The story spread like wildfire. From small lectures, Jacob Riis became a phenomenon. Newspapers all over New York reprinted his photos, not because they were beautiful, but because they were impossible to look away from. The same newsrooms that had once rejected Riis now begged to publish his work. The name Jacob Riis became synonymous with justice. But from here, he also came up against something more dangerous than poverty: power. Many industrial tycoons argued that Riis was smearing America. Some newspapers accused him of treason and sowing social division. Some threatened him. Others offered him money to be silent. But Riis was not afraid. He had faced death from starvation, so he had nothing left to lose. Instead of backing down, he moved forward. Every threat only convinced him that he was on the right path. Because if the light didn't blind the powerful, then it wasn't bright enough. The climax came when Riis published his photograph, Bandit's Roost, a notorious alley in Mulberry Bend. That image became a symbol, a group of young men in the shadows, their cold eyes staring directly into the lens. No one knew who they were, but all of America knew. This was the result of a society that had forgotten its poor. It was this photograph that forced the New York authorities to pay attention. The mayor at the time, William Strong, was pressured by public opinion. He ordered an investigation into the living conditions in the slums. And who was the first person called in to advise on reforms? Jacob Riis. From a wandering reporter, he stepped into the government's meeting rooms. From a nameless immigrant, he became an advisor to those in power. However, his journey did not stop at politics. For Riis, Justice was not found in speeches, it lay in action. He campaigned for the opening of schools, the construction of housing for workers, the establishment of public parks, and the reform of the tenement system. Whenever the city tore down a dilapidated tenement building, he would say, "A wall comes down, a dream is built up." But when the light shone on the dark corners, it also illuminated things that people did not want seen: resistance, hatred, and the hidden forces that were quietly waiting for him to make a mistake. And that is precisely where the second part of the story begins, when the light becomes a weapon and the darkness begins to fight back.
Part 2. The light switches on, and the darkness fights back. It begins there, where the photographs had shattered the veil of civility, where public opinion awakened, and where power began to cast its cold, watchful eyes. Jacob Riis quickly realized that the light he brought was not always welcomed. It forced those with vested interests to make a choice: continue to wear their gilded facade or confront the truth and change. And power, as always, does not yield easily. The attacks came from many sides. Pro-business newspapers accused Riis of tarnishing the city's image, of sowing instability. The tenement landlords feared losing their income. They lobbied, persuaded, threatened, because when the tenements were cleared, their profits would shrink. Politicians who favored backroom deals saw Riis as a menace. Fanning the flames of public opinion meant fanning the flames of demands for reform, and reform could disrupt their tight-knit business connections. Riis entered that vortex not with his fists, but by continuing to do what he knew best: telling stories with light. He increased the frequency of his presentations, expanded the reach of his photos, and drew audiences from every social class to bear witness. The photographs no longer appeared just on the pages of newspapers. They were projected on theater walls, hung in assembly halls, and included in investigative reports. Everywhere he went, one thing emerged: a collective sense of guilt and a demand for change that could not be extinguished. But power did not let it go. There were nights Riis was followed, times he received threatening letters. There were times he was criticized for exaggerating, that he was sensationalizing, that his photos showed only the ugliest piece of the puzzle and did not reflect the whole picture. And it was in those criticisms that Riis found a second weapon. He had to prove himself through actions, not just words. He joined forces with a group of reformers, teachers, pastors, and a few conscientious politicians, and they got to work. They started with concrete actions: opening night schools for working children, campaigning for public sanitation, and focusing on cleaning up the filthiest areas. They persuaded the government to allocate funds, to begin housing inspections, and to establish investigative committees. The work was not glamorous. It was daily, repetitive, but each action transformed Riis's light from a mere accusation into a framework for reform. However, the story wasn't just about tearing down and rebuilding houses. Persistent poverty always has the potential to regenerate if the economic and social structures do not change. The initial reforms could fix the surface, but if incomes didn't rise, if labor was still exploited, if racist and discriminatory mindsets remained, then the darkness would creep up again from every corner. Riis understood that. He didn't just want to reform buildings, he wanted to change how society viewed its workers. He convinced the community that immigrants and the poor were not waste products to be discarded. They were human beings with dignity, capable of contributing if given the chance. It was an ideological battle, sometimes even more fierce than the political one.
As Riis plunged into the work of improving lives, moral conflicts and controversies arose. Some critics argued that he depicted immigrants in a demeaning way, using heart-wrenching images to manipulate the viewer's emotions. It was argued that his light sometimes shone on dark corners without offering sustainable solutions, meaning it exposed suffering without simultaneously empowering those it depicted. These were significant debates, because the work of reform itself must always balance telling the truth with respecting the dignity of those whose stories are told. Riis, with his imperfect heart, sometimes made mistakes, but what was undeniable was this: he made the problem too big to be ignored. And when a problem becomes too big, the system is forced to respond. Let's pause for a moment to look at a small story of a child named Maria, a fictional name but one representing thousands of children in similar circumstances. Maria, 6 years old, wakes up in a dark room, touches the clay stove, and tries to keep the baby from crying so her mother can go to work. She is forced to work in a garment workshop, comes home exhausted, and suffers from rashes due to the living conditions. Before Riis's photos, viewers saw Maria, and many, moved, began to ask, how can a child be in this situation? And then, how can we fix it? Those who heard, asked, and then acted. Some donated money to open night schools. Some campaigned to establish public health clinics. Some stopped renting from unscrupulous landlords. Change, step by step, began with individual actions that spread to become community principles. And then one of the most important results was not the houses that were torn down or the policies that were enacted, but the change in perspective. When the upper class no longer saw the poor merely as a backdrop to highlight their own wealth, but began to see them as specific human beings, the system changed. That was the most profound victory Riis could have dreamed of. But history is rarely the story of a single person. Riis's light inspired many others, journalists, lawyers, politicians, social activists, to continue the work. Many small organizations sprang up, numerous urban reform movements developed, and a new moral foundation was formed, that society has a responsibility to its most vulnerable members. From this, we see traces of Riis's influence in reforms related to housing, public health, and education. The small parks, the night schools, the sanitation inspections, all bear the mark of a man who dared to turn on the light in a dark room. And now to the conclusion, where Riis's light is put to its greatest test, his legacy and the questions for today. Jacob Riis passed away, but the light he switched on did not go out. His photographs, articles, and lectures, they became source materials, historical documents, and a reminder: a society cannot truly progress if it closes its eyes to suffering. But his legacy is not just technical, it is a style of action, using data, evidence, and emotion to move the public conscience. Today, when we look at the pockets of poverty in cities, when we see modern slums, when injustice still exists in many forms, we still need that light. We still need people who dare to go down, dare to shine a light into the dark corners, dare to tell the stories with images and words so that society does not forget. Riis's light still shines today. This is not a nostalgic statement, it is a mandate. Social justice is not self-generating. It is created when someone dares to expose, when someone listens, and when the community decides to change. Riis gave us the example: light alone is not enough. Light must be accompanied by action. Today, investigative journalists photograph families who have lost their homes and workers in terrible conditions. Nonprofit organizations advocate for policy changes.
activists use social media to spread evidence. They are continuing the work that Riis began, showing others so they will care, so they will act. And there is one more thing. That light shines not only on the vulnerable, but also on us. When we look at those photographs, we don't just see Maria or that laborer, we see ourselves. We see our own choices, to be silent or to speak up, to ignore or to act. Jacob Riis taught us that exposure is not meant to shame. It is a call to responsibility. When the public takes responsibility, when the government takes responsibility, change becomes possible. And that is his enduring legacy. Not any single photograph, but the way his photographs awakened a society. In conclusion, Riis's story is not an epic of a great individual. It is the epic of a method. Light plus truth plus action equals social justice. It is a reminder that a gilded age may cover things up, but it cannot erase them forever. There will be those who try to conceal, who try to protect their interests, who will threaten and dismiss, but the light, if it continues to be switched on by those who refuse to be silent, will shake the very foundations of injustice. And today, as you turn off this video and return to your life, remember that the light is not just the responsibility of Jacob Riis or of journalists. The light is the responsibility of each and every one of us. A small action, a donation, volunteering, writing to a representative, calling out injustice can extend that beam of light and lead to a more just city. Jacob Riis turned on a light in the night. His light illuminated suffering, forced society to confront itself, and drove reform. Today, those lights are still burning, through journalism, through social activism, through people who refuse to be silent. And if we continue to do our part, that light will shine for generations to come, so that they never forget that beneath every gilded surface, there are still people who need to be seen and protected.